Good evening and welcome to the monastery on what here is an extremely heavy rainstorm going on outside. We sometimes get a front coming in from the South Pacific, which is euphemistically called the Pineapple Express because it roars in from the direction of Hawaii, I believe, and dumps a fair portion of the Pacific Ocean on the mainland of British Columbia. So we're having quite a heavy rainstorm right now, but otherwise pleasant enough. Sitting here in the library, and behind me you can see the whole row of Greek and Hebrew study guides, books for studying the Greek and Hebrew language, and analytical dictionaries of the Greek and Hebrew scriptures and other sorts of things. And I wanted to have them in the backdrop this evening because we're going to respond to a gentleman who calls himself Truth Surge. He belongs to one of the 1,000 or more Protestant denominations in the West, and he's trying to argue in favor of the doctrine of genetic guilt, which is officially called the doctrine of original sin. Now, why he has started to argue that each man personally inherits the guilt of Adam's sin, and is guilty of that sin, and should be punished for Adam's sin, even though the scripture quite clearly responds against such an idea, is beyond me. I have a suspicion that he really doesn't have a clue what the doctrine of original sin actually teaches, that he belongs to one of these miscellaneous Protestant sects that has completely disconnected itself from mainline Protestantism or something, and has its own confused and delusional understanding of what various terms in Christianity actually mean. I think that's probably the root of the problem. However, anyway, he's insisting that the New Testament and Apostle Paul teach that man receives a genetic guilt at birth, one of his genes that's passed on from Adam. That's essentially the doctrine of original sin. And this teaching, of course, came from Augustine, who's the poison in the stream of Christianity in the West. Augustine is the father of almost all Western heresies, and many of them come from his Manichaean Gnostic past, but even more from his Neoplatonism, his following of various Neoplatonist philosophers, as opposed to Apostle Paul and the Apostles. So I'm going to read a bit of a paper here that's going to be published soon. It's a draft. It's not finished. But let's just read it, because I suspect that this Truth Surge hasn't got a clue what he's talking about and doesn't really know what the doctrine of original sin teaches. He also seems to have an idolatrous veneration for the King James Version of the Scripture, even though it has so many mistranslations in it and leaves out substantial portions of the Scripture. There seems to have been a movement within the fundamentalist evangelical movement, particularly within North America, that set up the King James Version as a kind of idolatry, sort of like a statue of Jupiter or Zeus or something. And they even, some of them call King James St. James, although he was alternated between having male and female mistresses, and was called the wisest fool in Christendom because he could manipulate people so well. In any case, they don't know anything about King James either. But I'm going to read this paper, and it's only the beginning. We're going to go into a great deal of depth later on. According to Augustine, original sin is Adam's first sin, the sin whose guilt is the legacy of every individual born. In his own words, in him, Adam, constituted the form of condemnation to his future progeny, who should spring from him by natural descent. He says this in one of his works, on the sin, the original sin. In other words, the guilt of Adam is transmitted to all human beings. This guilt is remitted only through the actions of the priest in baptism. That is the grace of the sacrament administered by the priest, who, of course, has a corner on grace. Augustine claimed to have found this anthropology in the writings of St. Paul. In truth, he read his idea of original sin into the apostles' epistles. As N.P. Williams observes, of his proof text, and this is one of the catastrophes of sectarianism, they have all these proof texts. Instead of reading the entire scripture, they pick out little proof texts and twist them to fit a pre-established ideology. Of the 5 proof texts, of his 5 proof texts, there are mistranslations, and none more crucial than Romans 5:12. And he says this in his book, The Idea of the Fall and Original Sin. It's written in London, published in London in 1927. Moreover, his appeal to tradition, i.e. what he felt was the consensus of the fathers, was simply intellectually dishonest, because Augustine took as his task the completion of what he thought was the inadequate work of the Greek fathers. Augustine, by the way, did not speak, read, or write Greek, but somehow he thought he understood the New Testament better than the Greek fathers, who spoke the language. And he thought that the Greek fathers were not only poor, but his translation from the original Greek wasn't very accurate either. Or else he would surely have known that there is no father of the church, Greek or Latin, that defined original sin, that is the ancestral sin, as inherited guilt. Even if some of the later, such as Leo or Peter Chrysologos, used the expression, albeit in a more traditional sense, inherited mortality. Before dealing with the subject at hand, a few comments need to be made about the authority of Scripture and its interpretation. Following the Holy Fathers, the Orthodox Church holds that the Old and New Testaments are, to be sure, central to the divinely inspired and holy tradition, that is, to the true faith once delivered to the saints. Jude 3. The immutable tradition that comes to the Church from Christ through the apostles is the means by which Scripture is explained. Whatever the Textus Receptus or codices, papyri, and lexicons provide, it is tradition that judges Scripture, not the reverse. It is this truth that Augustine seems to have forgotten, and his followers rejected in their adoption of their pseudo-doctrine of original sin. Remember that the New Testament was created by the Orthodox Church. I know that'll cause Truth Surge to choke on his Wheaties in the morning when he has breakfast, but in any case, if he would look historically, he would find that that's precisely the case. There are too many things that might be said about original sin, but it is sufficient that we recognize the way in which its advocates mistreat and misread Romans 5:12, which lies at the heart of its exposition. Augustine accepted the erroneous Latin translation to this verse, which is rendered into English as, "Wherefore, as by one man sin entered into the world, and death by sin, so death passed on all men, for all have sinned." F.O. The Greek grammar is manipulated by Augustine in such a way as to favor his teaching. That is, it's a teaching he made up before he looked at the Scripture and then went rummaging through the Scripture for a proof text to try to prove it, sort of like the rapture, which is simply not taught in the Scripture. Not only was it an arbitrary translation, but in quo is not necessarily masculine and need not mean that Adam's progeny are punished in his stead, as if Christ is punished in our stead. Rightly translated, the original Greek produces, "Wherefore, as by one man sin entered the world, and through sin death, and on account of death all have sinned." It's precisely death that is the falling short or missing of the mark of everlasting life through union with God, which, of course, Christ has restored for us.